The world ends in fire and noise. The last thing she remembers of Europe is the scream of artillery and the smell of wet earth. Then, the shouting. Foreign words, sharp and loud. American voices. She is 21 years old. Her name is Annalise, a signals operator. Now, she is a prisoner. The propaganda had been a constant hum in the background of her life. Dr. Goebbels, voice on the radio, painting pictures of the enemy. Americans were gangsters, barbarians. They would do unspeakable things to the daughters of the Reich. This is the story of what happens when the monsters you were promised turn out to be something else entirely. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching this story unfold. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, terror was a thick, cold fog. The women huddled together, their gray uniforms damp with sea spray. They whispered stories of what awaited them. Starvation camps. Brutal interrogations. A life of hard labor in a frozen wasteland. Survival was the only prayer. They braced for the worst. But the worst never came. The train did not travel north into ice and snow. It rolled deep into the heart of a vast, flat land under an enormous blue sky, Kansas. The bus ride from the station was a journey into a dream. Tidy houses sat on perfect green lawns. Gleaming cars rolled down clean streets. There were no ruins. No skeletal buildings. No craters on the roads. The landscape was unnervingly peaceful. It was the first attack on her reality. The camp was another. They called it Camp Liberty, a name so ironic it felt like a deliberate taunt. But there were no mud-filled trenches, no electric fences, just neat rows of wooden barracks. It was stark, but it was clean. The second attack came through the air. Not the smell of coal smoke and decay, but the sharp, clean scent of pine. Then came the showers. They were stripped of their uniforms and led to a concrete building. This is it, they thought, the gas chambers. Just as they had been warned. Some women wept. Others held hands, their knuckles white. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the sound echoing with finality. Then water rained down from the ceiling, hot water. Not lukewarm. Not cold. A true, steaming, wonderful heat. For women who had not known such a luxury in years, it was a shock that went deeper than the skin. It washed away the grime, and with it, the first layer of indoctrination. Barbarians did not give their prisoners hot water. The next assault happened in the mess hall. They stood in line, expecting watery soup and black bread. Instead, they were handed trays heavy with food. There was bacon, sizzling and salty. There were eggs, and there was the bread. It was impossibly white, soft as a cloud. Nothing like the dense, sawdust-filled war bread that scraped the throat. With it came a thick, brown paste. An American guard, a boy younger than her brother, saw her staring. He took a spoonful and ate it, shrugging. "Peanut butter," he mouthed. The word meant nothing. She tasted it. Salty, sweet, rich. It was the most bizarre and decadent flavor she had ever known. That night, Annalise lay on a cot with a clean blanket. Her stomach was full. Her body was clean. She was warm. She was not being interrogated. She was not being beaten. The Americans were not the monsters from the radio. They were something else. Something harder to understand. This kindness, this casual abundance, felt more menacing than any cruelty she had imagined. It had to be a trick. A performance. But for what purpose? Lying in the quiet darkness of the barracks, surrounded by the soft breathing of other confused women, a new fear began to grow. A fear not of what the Americans would do to them, but of why they were not doing anything at all. The first days settled into a strange rhythm, a life governed by bells. Wake up, roll call, breakfast, work details, lunch, more work, dinner, lights out. It was the predictable, monotonous life of a prisoner. But the details were all wrong. The work was in the laundry, folding sheets that smelled of soap and sunshine, not stitching uniforms for a collapsing front. Or in the kitchens, peeling potatoes by the sackful, more food than she had seen in one place in years. The abundance was relentless. It was an assault. One day, a crate of dark, curved glass bottles arrived. Coca-Cola. A guard popped one open for a woman who was struggling with a heavy laundry basket. She drank it hesitantly. The sweet, fizzy shock was like a jolt of electricity. It tasted of chemicals and sugar, and a world she could not comprehend. The women passed the bottle around, each taking a tiny, curious sip, their faces a mixture of disgust and fascination. From the guards, radios came a new sound. Not the martial marches of the Reich or the somber classical music approved by the Ministry of Propaganda. This was a wild, chaotic sound, a storm of brass and drums that seemed to have no rules. Jazz. It was the sound of a people who are not afraid. It was the sound of freedom, and it was terrifying. The guards themselves were a constant source of confusion. They were boys mostly, farm kids from Ohio and Iowa, their faces open and unreadable. They chewed a sweet-smelling gum constantly. And they played a game, a bizarre ritual with a wooden bat and a small, hard ball. They would spend hours in the afternoon sun, running and shouting in a field, for no discernible purpose. Baseball, they called it. The women watched from behind the mess hall, trying to understand the rules. They could not. It seemed pointless. A waste of energy. A luxury only a nation untouched by war could afford. One afternoon, a car pulled up to the camp headquarters. A man in a civilian suit got out, carrying a briefcase. A representative from the International Red Cross. He was Swiss. Neutral. He inspected the barracks, the kitchens, the infirmary. Annalise saw him making notes on a clipboard. Later, a rumor spread through the barracks, whispered from cot to cot. The inspector shared his findings with the camp interpreter. He had just come from reviewing reports on Allied prisoners in Germany. The official ration for an American prisoner of war in a German camp was supposed to be 1,500 calories a day. In reality, Red Cross reports from 1944 showed most received less than 1,000. Many starved. Here, in Camp Liberty, the daily caloric intake for German prisoners was nearly 3,000. The inspector noted the prevalence of chocolate bars in the camp canteen, available for purchase with the small scrip they earned from their work. Chocolate. Back home, a single square was a birthday present. Here, it was a casual snack. The fact landed in the barracks like a stone. It was not just kindness, it was policy. A calculated, deliberate abundance. The American war machine was not just producing tanks and planes by the hundreds of thousands. It was producing peanut butter and Coca-Cola on a scale that defied imagination. The knowledge created a rift among the women. Some saw it as a trick, a psychological weapon designed to break their spirit. They refused to eat the sweet white bread. They spat on the ground when the jazz music played. Loyalty to the homeland, even a losing one, was all they had left. Others accepted the small comforts with a quiet, desperate gratitude. It was a simple matter of survival. Annalise found herself caught in the middle. Every bite of food was an act of betrayal. Every night in a warm bed was a crime against her family, who were likely huddled in a freezing cellar, listening for the air raid sirens. The guilt was a physical weight. Then the letters started arriving from home. Censored, delayed by months, they were ghosts from another world. Annalise received one from her mother. The paper was thin, almost transparent. The handwriting was shaky. Her mother wrote of the constant bombing raids, the lack of food, the endless cold. She described how they made soup from nettles and old potato peels. She mentioned a neighbor's daughter, a girl Annalise had grown up with, killed while waiting in a bread line. The letter ended with a simple, heartbreaking sentence. "We are proud of your sacrifice for the fatherland. Be strong." Annalise read the letter in her bunk, the words blurring through her tears. She looked at her own hands, soft and clean. Her stomach was full from a dinner of roast beef and potatoes. That afternoon, a guard had given her a Hershey's bar, just because. She still had half of it wrapped in her pocket. The reality of her prison was a paradise compared to the hell of her family's freedom. If this story is challenging what you thought you knew, subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. Her mother's words about sacrifice echoed in her mind. What sacrifice was she making? Her greatest struggle was the moral whiplash of being treated with more dignity by her enemies than her own people could afford for their citizens. The propaganda had promised monsters. But the real monster was the quiet, gnawing realization that everything she had ever believed in was built on a foundation of lies and starvation. Her loyalty was to a ghost, an idea that was being systematically dismantled by hot showers and peanut butter. A few days later, the camp commandant assembled them again. The war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific raged on. American men were still fighting and dying. The labor shortage at home was critical. He announced a new program, approved by the government. The women would be given an opportunity. They could volunteer for paid work on the local farms, not under guard. They would live and work alongside American families, planting crops, harvesting vegetables. For the first time, they would step outside the confines of the camp, not as prisoners, but as something else, something new, something uncertain. The offer split the barracks in two, a chance to work on a farm, to leave the camp during the day. It was a fracture line running down the center of their world. For some, it was a test of loyalty. To accept was to collaborate, to fraternize with the enemy while brothers and fathers died. They called those who signed up traitors. They whispered the word in the laundry, their voices sharp as needles. For others, it was a chance to breathe, to feel the sun on their face without a fence casting a shadow, to do honest work, the kind that made your muscles ache in a good way. It was a choice between the honor of a ghost and the simple dignity of being alive. Annalise signed the list. She did not know why. A week later, they were assembled in the mess hall again, not for an announcement, but for a film, a projector whirred in the back of the room. The women settled onto the benches, expecting another American movie, another story of smiling people with perfect teeth. The lights went down. The film flickered to life. It was not Hollywood. The images were black and white, grainy, unsteady. A bulldozer pushed a mountain of pale, naked bodies into a pit. The bodies were like sticks. A soldier walked through a barracks filled with skeletal figures in striped pajamas, their eyes vast and empty and shrunken faces. The camera panned across piles of shoes, mountains of eyeglasses, bales of human hair. An American narrator's voice, translated by their camp interpreter, spoke names that meant nothing and everything. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The mess hall was utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The air grew thick, unbreathable. This was not propaganda. This was something else. This was a mirror held up to their nation, to their cause, to themselves. The monsters from Dr. Goebbels' radio were real, but they were not the Americans. They wore the same uniform Annalise's father wore. A woman in the front row began to vomit. The sound was a lone, wretched punctuation in the crushing silence. Annalise stared at the screen, her mind a white void. The lie was not a crack in the foundation. The foundation itself was gone. There was nothing underneath. The next day there was a lecture. An American officer stood before them with a chart. He did not speak of ideology, he spoke of numbers. In 1944, he explained, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany produced 40,000. He spoke of ships, of tanks, of trucks. He mentioned that a single American factory, Willow Run, built one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. He spoke of food production, of oil, of steel. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a flat, dispassionate tone. It was an autopsy. He was calmly, methodically explaining the exact cause of their nation's death. It was not a glorious battle of spirit against numbers. It was a simple, brutal equation of mathematics. They had never had a chance. The knowledge was not liberating. It was annihilating. It turned all their sacrifices, all their suffering, into a pointless, tragic waste. Annalise went to the farm. It was a small plot of land, owned by a man named Miller. He was old, his face a road map of wrinkles from the sun. His wife, Sarah, was quiet. She showed Annalise how to weed the rows of beans, how to feed the chickens. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of a hoe and the chirping of birds. For lunch, they sat under a large oak tree and ate sandwiches made with the soft white bread. Sarah gave her a glass of cold milk. It was the purest, simplest thing Annalise had tasted in her life. This quiet farm, with its endless sky and its predictable chores, felt 1,000 worlds away from the newsreels and the statistics. It was a fragile sanity. One afternoon, a jeep from the camp brought supplies and a stack of new letters. Annalise opened one from her cousin. The city of Dresden, she wrote, was gone. It had disappeared in a storm of fire. Nothing was left but ashes and melted stone. The letter spoke of starvation, of refugees clogging the roads, of children who no longer cried because they lacked the strength. The war was over, but the dying was not. Annalise folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She walked to the chicken coop, the Kansas sun warm on her neck. The contrast was a physical sickness. The peaceful clucking of the hens, the smell of hay, the sight of Sarah Miller hanging laundry on a line, the white sheets brilliant against the blue sky. It was all too much. Later, the same Jeep brought news. A woman back at the camp, a fierce patriot from Hamburg named Greta, had taken one of those white sheets from the laundry. She had hanged herself from the rafters. She left a note. It said only 2 words. For the fatherland. The words felt like a language Annalise no longer understood. That evening, Annalise sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the fireflies begin to glow in the twilight. She could not reconcile the world in her cousin's letter with the world in front of her. She was a prisoner living in a paradise, while her family was free in an inferno. The guilt was a stone in her gut. Sarah came out and sat in the rocking chair beside her. She said nothing. She just handed Annalise a small, lumpy object wrapped in wax paper. Annalise opened it. It was a piece of apple cake, still warm, a simple act of kindness. From an enemy. From a woman whose own sons were likely fighting in the Pacific. The absurdity, the humanity of it, broke through the dam of her control. A single tear tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. Then another. She wept silently, for the first time since she was captured. She wept for Greta, for Dresden, for the lie of the fatherland, and for the terrible, confusing kindness of apple cake. A few days passed. Annalise found a rhythm in the work, a numbness in the routine. She was collecting eggs when the miller's son, a small boy of 5 named Sam, followed her into the barn. He was chasing a kitten and tripped over a hay bale, his knee hitting the hard-packed dirt. The cry was instant, a sharp wail of pain and surprise. Before she could think, Annalise was moving. She scooped the boy up. He was light in her arms. She held him close, rocking him gently, murmuring the only words of comfort that came to her mind. Soothing phrases in German. "It will be all right, little one. Shh, be calm." The barn door flew open. Sarah stood there, her face white with panic. She froze, her eyes wide. She saw Annalise, the German soldier, the enemy, holding her crying child. The boy's arms were wrapped around Annalise's neck. Annalise stopped rocking. She looked at Sarah. The world stopped. The lowing of the cows in the pasture, the buzzing of flies in the sunlit air, it all faded away. There was only the space between them. A space filled with war and death and propaganda, and 2 women from different worlds, and a small boy's tears. Sarah's expression was unreadable. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something else, something Annalise could not name. And in that silent, terrifying moment, Annalise realized her life was no longer in the hands of guards or commandants, but in the hands of this one American mother. Sarah did not scream. She did not run. She simply stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright Kansas sun, time stretched, thin and brittle. Annalise could feel the boy's small heart beating against her chest. She expected a shout, an accusation. Instead, Sarah took a slow step forward. Then another. She knelt beside them on the dusty floor. She looked not at Annalise, the enemy, but at her son. Gently, she wiped a tear from his cheek with her thumb. Then she looked at Annalise. Her eyes were not filled with hate. They were filled with a weary, shared understanding that transcended uniforms and language. It was the understanding of a mother. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an absolution, a treaty signed in a dusty barn over a child's scraped knee. The war ended not with a trumpet blast, but with the crackle of a radio on the miller's kitchen counter. A voice announced that a city in Japan had vanished under a new kind of sun. Then another. And then it was over. The men in the jeeps who came to the farm to take Annalise back to the camp were not somber. They were loud and laughing, handing out cigarettes and chewing gum. For them it was an ending. For Annalise it was the beginning of a terrifying uncertainty. The journey home was the war in reverse. She crossed an ocean that was no longer a hunting ground for submarines, on a ship filled not with dread, but with a hollow, anxious silence. They disembarked in a French port that was slowly being rebuilt. Then the train ride east, into the heart of what was left. Germany was a skeleton. Cities were fields of rubble, where street signs pointed to phantom avenues. The air tasted of ash. People moved like ghosts, their faces gray with hunger and a shame so profound it had replaced all other emotions. She found her family in a crowded basement room, in a town that was barely a town anymore. Her mother was thin, her hair white. Her father had lost an arm. They embraced her, a fragile, desperate clutch. They asked no questions about her time as a prisoner. They did not want to know. In their world of scavenged potatoes and bitter grief, there was no room for stories of hot showers and apple cake. Her experience was an obscene luxury, a truth so alien it could only be a betrayal. So Annalise said nothing. Her captivity, the kindest and most transformative period of her life, became her darkest secret. She buried it under a mountain of silence. Years passed. The rubble was cleared. Buildings rose again. But the ruins inside were harder to mend. Annalise would sometimes stand in her small kitchen, holding a piece of bread, and be paralyzed by its texture, its weight. She would see children playing a game with a ball and a stick, and feel a phantom echo of a Kansas afternoon. The kindness of her enemies had become a private shame. It had saved her body but broken her connection to her own people. She was a survivor, but she was utterly alone in her memory of the war. She was taught that the greatest horror of war was the cruelty of the enemy. She learned it was their mercy. It was the quiet, undeniable evidence that her entire world, her cause, her sacrifice, was a lie. Defeat on the battlefield was an honorable wound. But to have your soul conquered by a piece of chocolate and a mother's gentle nod, that was an annihilation from which there was no recovery. What truly stays with you from this story? Like this video if it made you think, subscribe for more hidden histories, and tell us in the comments what you believe was Annalise's greatest loss.